Some mysteries stay locked away for years, even decades, haunting everyone involved. But every so often, the impossible finally gets cracked wide open. Today, I'm going to take you through 3 true detective cases that kept the world guessing, until the answers finally surfaced. And the first one? Well, imagine walking into a hotel room where everything looks perfectly normal. No blood, no signs of struggle, only to learn later that the man inside died from injuries as severe as a car crash. How do you explain a death like that? The answer lies in room 348, and what happened there is stranger than fiction. Greg Fleniken was found dead on the evening of September 15, 2010, in room 348 of the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. His co-workers had been trying to reach him for hours, and when he didn't show up to a meeting, they asked hotel management to unlock his door. Inside, they found Greg lying on the floor between the bed and the wall. His body was stiff, his face calm. For police, the scene itself posed no obvious questions. Greg's wallet sat untouched on the desk, still holding cash and credit cards. The bed was neatly made, the room undisturbed. Everything appeared ordinary, except for the man lying dead on the floor. Authorities immediately suspected a natural death, most likely a heart attack. Greg was 55 years old, a chain smoker, and sedentary. His wife, Susie, told officers that he ate what he liked, didn't exercise much, and was someone you might describe as stubborn. A fatal health incident felt like the simplest explanation, and with his medical history in mind, the initial report didn't raise any alarms. But it was the little things that began to prick at Susie's instincts. She knew Greg was right-handed, but in one hand a cigarette was still lightly pinched between his left fingers, like he'd been mid-puff when he collapsed. And then there was the air conditioning, or lack of it. Beaumont in September could be sweltering, yet the room was unusually warm, as if someone had deliberately turned off the unit. These details itched at her mind, but seemed insignificant in the larger picture, until the autopsy results came back. When Greg's body was examined, the medical examiner immediately hit a wall of confusion. Internally, Greg's injuries were catastrophic. His ribs were broken on one side, his heart was lacerated, his liver split nearly in 2. They were the kinds of injuries you'd see in a high-speed car accident. But there was a problem. There were no external wounds to justify the trauma. No bruises, no lacerations, no evidence on his skin to indicate what could have caused such violent damage inside his body. At first, the medical examiner considered some sort of freak medical event. But the more the examiner studied the case, the less sense it made. And by the time the autopsy was done, they suspected foul play. There was one major setback. Without external injuries, and with no sign of a struggle in the hotel room, the case stalled before it even started. Detective Scott Apple from the Beaumont Police Department reviewed the scanned evidence, but found himself going around in circles. No suspects, no motive, no witnesses. Guest records at the hotel revealed nothing unusual. The neighbors hadn't noticed or heard a thing. Greg had been staying in room 348 by himself while on a business trip. He had spent the evening exactly how you'd expect, a routine that was easy to piece together. He ate a quiet dinner alone in his hotel room, called his wife later in the evening, and turned in for bed. By all accounts, his death should have been just as mundane as his evening. For months, the case sat untouched. Greg's wife, Susie, however, was relentless. She refused to accept the idea that her husband had died from a medical condition, no matter what the early reports suggested. She reread the autopsy papers obsessively and went over every detail investigators shared with her. She knew deep down they were missing something, but there were no breadcrumbs to follow. Just the unsettling realization that her husband's death was both abnormal and inexplicable. Still, she pressed anyone who would listen for answers, hoping someone, somewhere, knew what she couldn't figure out herself. 7 months passed, and no new leads surfaced. But Susie's persistence never wavered, and her search for closure ultimately led her to someone whose specialty was opening doors that others had missed. At first glance, Greg Fleniken's death seemed like one of those tragedies we'd all like to chalk up to fate. A man goes to bed and simply doesn't wake up the next morning. But behind the stillness of room 348, the heat in the air and the bizarre inner trauma that should have been impossible, there lay something deeper, something that had been deliberately hidden. To uncover it, someone would need to step back and look past the apparent, to see what others had dismissed. Ken Brennan was not the type of investigator to take on a case unless he believed he could crack it. A former Long Island cop and DEA agent, Brennan had built a formidable reputation as a private investigator who specialized in solving the unsolvable. Described as both intuitive and methodical, he worked with an unrelenting focus on details others had overlooked. So when Susie Fleniken contacted him in desperation, he listened. From the outset, Brennan approached the case like a puzzle, missing most of its pieces. He started where others had stalled, the square footage of room 348. The first thing he flagged was something so trivial it felt like an afterthought: the room's thermostat. According to Susie, her husband couldn't stand heat. He would have turned the air conditioning on as soon as he walked through the door. Yet when Greg's body was discovered, the room had been unusually warm. It was a small inconsistency, so small that most wouldn't have given it a second thought, but Brennan had seen cases tilt on less. He pored over the autopsy report next, flipping through every detail. The internal damage was massive, but still unaccounted for by any external signs of trauma. Brennan found himself circling back to one question. If Greg's body showed no wounds on the outside, could something external have reached him in a way most investigators hadn't considered? That line of thinking led him to make a simple but decisive move: to stand in the middle of room 348 and examine every inch of space as though he were staring at it for the first time. It was during this re-examination that he found something previous investigators had failed to notice. On the wall shared with the adjacent room 349, there was a faintly visible patch, the kind used to conceal damage. The patched wall didn't explain anything yet, but it raised questions. Brennan suspected the patch covered a hole, one that had been repaired quickly, possibly by someone with a motive to hide it. To confirm his theory, Brennan brought in a laser device to trace a potential trajectory. He marked where Greg's body had been found and traced a line from there to the patched wall. The result was unsettling. The laser beam cut through the patch straight into the adjoining room, where the beam ended on a wall in room 349. Suspicions turned into a working theory. A bullet had been fired from room 349, passed through the wall, and struck Greg while he sat on the bed. But now, he needed to prove it. Room 349 had been rented to a group of union electricians that night, most of whom had been in town for a job. Brennan worked with Detective Scott Apple to track them down and start questioning. The electricians initially brushed off any connection to Greg's death. They claimed they knew nothing about any gunshots, nor had they heard or seen anything unusual that night. But Brennan wasn't looking for stories to match their claims. He asked precise questions and watched the cracks emerge in their responses, focusing on their body language and the moments of hesitation. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the repaired wall confirmed what Brennan had suspected. There was damage consistent with a bullet hole that had been patched up, and residue on the wall matched materials found inside Greg's body. The mounting evidence began to close in. Eventually, one of the electricians confessed that someone among their group did in fact have a gun that night, a detail they'd conveniently left out during earlier questioning. According to the confession, Lance Mueller, one of the electricians, had brought his 9mm Ruger handgun into room 349. At some point, he mishandled the weapon and accidentally fired it. The bullet entered the shared wall, traveled into room 348, and hit Greg while he was sitting on his bed. What made the story even more tragic was its simplicity, an accident hidden by a hurried cover-up. Brennan learned that after realizing what had happened, the electricians panicked. Instead of calling for help, they patched the hole with toothpaste and made up their minds to stay quiet. They must have assumed no one would connect the incident to the death next door, especially since police had initially ruled it as a heart attack. For months, that silence worked. The confession confirmed the final piece of the puzzle. What at first looked like an impossible crime, a man mysteriously wounded with no external evidence, was brought to light through Brennan's relentless attention to detail. Greg Fleniken had been killed by an accidental gunshot, a murder committed in secret, though unintentional. A patched wall and a series of lies had nearly buried the truth. Greg Fleniken's death shows how even the smallest, overlooked details can cloak the truth in plain sight. At first, it seemed impossible that a man could suffer devastating injuries with no outward sign. Yet a patched wall, an idle cigarette, and a warm room contained all the clues needed to solve an invisible murder. Ken Brennan's persistence, examining what others dismissed, serves as a reminder. Assumptions can obscure justice. His work brings to life the value of questioning everything, even when answers seem clear. In room 348, nothing screamed for attention. But with patience and perspective, the silent clues finally spoke. Next is a case that shook even the most seasoned investigators. A death surrounded by silence, suspicion, and something far darker. Picture this. You're one of the world's most experienced paranormal investigators, well-versed in the dangers of cursed objects. Now imagine being found dead without a scratch on you, just steps away from the very artifact you've been warning others about. That's exactly what happened to Dan Rivera. Dan Rivera's final night was supposed to be just another stop on his nationwide tour, but it ended in unexplained tragedy. Rivera, a paranormal investigator with decades of experience, had arrived in the city to showcase a collection of haunted artifacts connected to the Warren family's infamous line of work. Known for their extensive research into the supernatural, the Warrens had spent years gathering cursed objects from haunted locations. And Rivera, a trusted member of their team, had been tasked with bringing their eerie legacy to audiences across the country. That night, Rivera checked into a quiet mid-range hotel that had been selected for its discreet location. His room was modest, standard bed, television, a desk tucked into the far corner, but sufficient for the few hours he planned to spend there. Witnesses described him as cheerful earlier in the evening, energized after hosting an event where he showcased items like broken mirrors said to hold spirits, a set of ceremonial daggers used in exorcisms, and of course, the infamous Annabelle doll. Annabelle, often touted as one of the most dangerous artifacts in the collection, was held securely in a specially designed glass case, reinforced with prayers and blessings meant to keep its influence contained. Rivera knew the risks. It wasn't his first tour with Annabelle, but by all accounts, he loosened his tie that night thinking it was just the end of another routine stop. The following morning, a hotel worker knocked on Rivera's door after he missed checkout. With no response, management entered and discovered his motionless body lying on the bed. The scene was unnervingly calm. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of a struggle. Rivera's belongings, including the key to Annabelle's case, were untouched and neatly placed on the desk. But their unease grew when they noticed what he had been traveling with. The case holding Annabelle, which was supposed to remain firmly locked at all times, was slightly ajar. The doll, though still inside, appeared to have shifted position. Its blank eyes, covered in scuff marks from years of handling, seemed to stare off into the empty room. To the casual observer, Annabelle might look like an ordinary Raggedy Ann doll. But its history as a cursed object stretches back decades. Originally introduced to the Warrens in the 1970s, the doll allegedly caused physical harm, psychological torment, and even death to those who interacted with it. It had been deemed so dangerous that it was placed in a protective case designed to never open accidentally. Even the smallest measure of carelessness was thought to give the entity inside, believed by many to be a demonic force, a chance to act, handling the object, especially without permission or the proper protections, has long been associated with unexplained accidents. Rivera himself had spoken about Annabelle's dangers during his presentations, urging attendees never to underestimate it. He would say the case wasn't just physical protection, it was an imprisonment, a barrier between the living and whatever lingered on the other side. The official cause of death listed on Rivera's report was natural causes, specifically a heart attack. However, those closest to him struggled to accept this explanation. At 47 years old, Rivera was in excellent health. He didn't smoke, he exercised regularly, and his medical record showed no history of heart conditions. The suddenness and timing were unnerving enough to draw suspicion, especially when paired with the detail about Annabelle's unlocked case. While investigators found no physical evidence directly tying the doll to his death, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. People who had attended the event just hours before reported seeing Rivera in high spirits, laughing and answering questions well into the evening. No one had suspected that by morning, his life would come to such a mysterious and tragic end. But there was one detail that pushed the story deeper into disturbing territory. In the weeks leading up to his death, Rivera had worked on 3 separate cases involving alleged demonic hauntings. In one instance, he investigated a family claiming their child was being terrorized by shadow figures. Another involved a dilapidated church reportedly haunted by aggressive entities. These investigations had earned Rivera a reputation as someone fearless in the face of dark forces, but they also left a mark. Fellow researchers later recalled that he seemed drained during this stretch, mentally and physically. Some speculated that he might have unknowingly carried something with him, a lingering attachment or unresolved energy from one of these locations. As the details surrounding Rivera's death came to light, questions naturally turned toward the role of Annabelle in the unfolding tragedy. Paranormal enthusiasts debated whether the doll itself had acted, or if it had simply served as a conduit for something Rivera encountered elsewhere. One theory suggested that the open case was no accident, but instead a warning, a deliberate act by whatever force was responsible. Skeptics, of course, dismissed this, arguing that stress or pre-existing issues could have caused his heart to give out. But with no signs pointing clearly in one direction, the uncertainty only fed into the lore. But the mystery deepens when you realize this wasn't the first time Annabelle's presence coincided with tragedy. Annabelle has been at the center of controversy for decades, but what makes this case different? The doll's reputation is already legendary, having left a trail of chaos and fear beginning in 1970. That was the year it first came to public attention, after a nursing student named Donna received it as a gift. Initially, it seemed harmless, but strange occurrences quickly began. Donna and her roommate reportedly noticed the doll moving on its own, shifting positions as though it had a life of its own. Objects in their apartment were mysteriously relocated, unsettling whispers echoed in the dark, and ominous messages scrawled on parchment paper began appearing out of nowhere. These events escalated to the point where they sought help from a local medium. The medium claimed the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle. But the terror only increased when the famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren became involved. Their conclusion? The doll wasn't housing the spirit of a young girl. It was a tool of a far more dangerous, demonic force. After taking possession of the doll, the Warrens made it clear how serious the situation was, noting that contact with Annabelle could result in dire consequences. Over the years, they documented stories of injuries, accidents, and even deaths linked to those who ignored Annabelle's warnings. One particularly chilling account involved a visiting priest whose car overturned shortly after mocking the doll during a private blessing. Reports of similar tragedies reinforced the understanding that Annabelle was no ordinary artifact. The Warrens encased it in a specially constructed display case, reinforced with prayers and a clear warning: positively do not open. The case itself was designed to remain locked under all circumstances, a safeguard to keep whatever power resided within the doll contained. The case in Dan Rivera's room, inexplicably, was not locked. To those familiar with Annabelle's history, this seems impossible to explain away. Accounts of the doll's behavior over the years have never included anything as restrained as simply existing outside its case. Instead, people claim Annabelle's influence often unfolds indirectly, with its malevolence radiating outward. A doll moving across the room may sound like something out of a cheap horror film, but it's the accidents, the sharp, tragic twists of fate, that are harder to brush off. For example, a museum visitor reportedly collapsed, after taunting Annabelle's glass case during a tour. Though skeptics argue those incidents could be coincidental or psychosomatic, they still contribute to its mystique. Rivera's death brings new complexity to this puzzle. The eerie detail of the ajar case, paired with his demise, demands far more than easy dismissal. The protocols surrounding Annabelle were among the strictest of any object in the Warren family collection. When on tour, Rivera and his team followed a methodical procedure. Annabelle was transported in her locked casing at all times, and nobody apart from Rivera himself had access to the key. During events, the doll was displayed in controlled settings, with Rivera emphasizing its dangers to audiences. On the night before his death, none of these procedures, to anyone's knowledge, had been breached. The case's locking mechanism had never been known to fail, and as far as those close to Rivera can confirm, no mishandling occurred. Yet something or someone managed to tamper with it. This is where theories within the paranormal community start to diverge. Some believers argue Annabelle didn't need to leave its case to exert influence. They suggest the doll may have acted as a conduit for a demonic entity, loosening physical barriers to target Rivera directly. It's notable that he spent the final weeks of his life investigating 3 separate cases of alleged high-intensity hauntings. Could some energy from one of those cases have latched onto him, using the doll as a medium to deliver a fatal blow? Others propose the strain of years of handling cursed objects took an immeasurable, unseen toll on Rivera, weakening his defenses against forces far beyond human comprehension. Meanwhile, skeptics have their own take on the situation. They point to a lack of clear evidence connecting the doll to Rivera's death. No fingerprints, no strange forces recorded on security cameras, and no observable signs of supernatural activity in the hotel room. From this perspective, they suggest the open case could be traced to human error or a fluke mechanical issue, and Rivera's death might simply be a tragic coincidence. But what this theory doesn't explain is how the same locked case, constructed to prevent any accidental opening, could have coincidentally failed for the first time in its entire history. Importantly, this isn't the first time Annabelle's case has allegedly been found open without explanation. Over the years, there have been scattered reports of the case mysteriously unsealing during storage or on other tours, but none were tied directly to a death. Rivera's case stands apart because of its deadly outcome, making it unlike anything seen before in the Warrens' long history of handling Annabelle. Whether it's the doll itself or the energy surrounding it, one thing is clear. Something led to this case being remembered, not just for its mysteries, but for its consequences. Whatever the truth may be, Rivera's death leaves us with one haunting question. Was it the doll, or something far darker? Dan Rivera's death remains one of the most chilling mysteries in the paranormal world. A seasoned investigator in perfect health, gone without warning, and under circumstances that raise more questions than answers. Was it simply a tragic coincidence, or did unseen forces play a role? The open case holding Annabelle only deepens the mystery, fueling speculation within and beyond the paranormal community. The Adams County Coroner's Office may officially dismiss suspicion, but the public isn't so sure. One thing is certain: whether you believe in the supernatural or not, Annabelle's history proves the line between myth and reality is razor thin. But just when you think you've heard it all, our next story takes us to a place so disturbing, it didn't just terrify a family, it forced doctors, police, and even priests to confront something they couldn't explain. You think you've seen horror movies that push the boundaries of fear. What if I told you that the real-life events at 3860 Carolina Street outdo any Hollywood script? Swarms of flies, shadowy figures, and a child scaling a wall. This is one story that's hard to believe. Moving into a home at 3860 Carolina Street must have seemed like the start of something new for Latoya Ammons and her 3 children. It wasn't a luxurious house by any means, but it was a place of their own, a space ready to be filled with fresh memories and brighter days. As the days turned into weeks, though, that excitement began to dim, replaced by an unease that couldn't easily be explained. The family wasn't superstitious or particularly prone to fears of the paranormal, but something about their new home felt off, and it didn't take long for subtle to turn into unescapable. One of the first unusual events that LaToya noticed wasn't subtle at all. It was the flies. They appeared in droves, buzzing around the windows and upstairs rooms, no matter how much she swatted, sprayed, or cleaned. Swarms of them, and during the dead of winter, no less. Annoying as it was, she chalked it up to an issue with the house. Maybe there was a nest in the walls or something, and yet, the longer it persisted, the harder it became to ignore the tension building in the air. Soon after, her family began hearing footsteps at night, heavy and deliberate, yet every time they checked, no one was there. Then, there were the shadows, not standard tricks of the light or fleeting glimpses out of the corner of someone's eye. These shadows seemed to move with intent, even standing still under impossible circumstances, lingering just long enough to send shivers down their spines. One time, LaToya found muddy footprints on the living room floor, although no one had come inside wearing shoes, let alone walked across the carpet. By now, the children were affected too. Something was wrong, but finding answers proved harder than expected. LaToya sought help in her community, turning to local churches for guidance. They'd say a few prayers or anoint the walls with oil, but whatever was happening seemed unmoved by their efforts. Growing more desperate, she visited a psychic, who told her what no one wants to hear. The house was haunted, cursed actually, and not by just any spirit. The psychic claimed hundreds of malevolent entities occupied the home. Naturally, LaToya wanted to fight back, so she took to cleansing rituals herself. This meant burning sage, performing small ceremonies, and laying out religious items. But no matter how often she tried, the disturbances only seemed to escalate. Doors slammed without warning, objects disappeared and reappeared in odd places, and the air inside the house grew heavier, like it was pressing down on them. Then came the night that everything changed. It was a family gathering. Relatives came over hoping to lend support or at least provide some temporary comfort. While they were all sitting together in the living room, something happened that they would never forget. Without warning, LaToya's oldest daughter began levitating. Her body rose into the air as if picked up by invisible hands. Everyone froze, unsure of what to do. Prayers were shouted, arms reached out, but for over a minute, they could only watch in terror before she slowly came back down. When it was over, she was pale, weak, unresponsive, unable to recall what had happened. Anything that hadn't yet believed something was truly, deeply wrong. That was the moment denial no longer mattered. Word of the house spread quickly. Friends and relatives who used to visit regularly began limiting how often they came by, or worse, stopped coming altogether. Some claimed to feel sick just walking up to the front porch, and others insisted their cars wouldn't start if they parked too close. So, with most of their support system shrinking before their eyes, the Ammons family was forced to struggle through the terrifying unknown, increasingly alone. What followed wasn't just a downward spiral. It was like being thrown into the unknown, with each night bringing new levels of terror. There were scratches on the children's arms that couldn't be explained, constant whispers that didn't belong to anyone in the house, and lights flickering off and on with no electrical explanation. The family tried sleeping in the same room for safety, yet the disturbances followed them. It was as though the house wasn't just haunted by external spirits. It was turning their own minds against them, wearing them down piece by piece. And yet, all of this was only the beginning. The Ammons family was about to find themselves in a position they never imagined, sharing their horror with people trained to approach everything with reason. What happens when skeptics, professionals, and authority figures witness the same unexplainable events you've been living through? And even more unsettling, what if even they have no answers? By April 2012, things had gone from bad to far worse for the Ammons family. What once seemed like disturbing yet manageable events had reached a breaking point. LaToya Ammons, exhausted and terrified, brought her children to a hospital in Gary, Indiana. Their behavior had become increasingly violent and unpredictable, and she worried they were no longer safe. even from themselves. The visit began like any other. The hospital staff went about their usual tasks, skeptical of Latoya's claims as she recounted what her family had endured. Some staff quietly dismissed her as overstressed or overly imaginative, while others documented her story with clinical detachment. But as the night unfolded, skepticism would turn into something far darker. It started with the youngest son. During a routine examination, he began cursing at one of the doctors. But his voice, it wasn't the voice of a child. It was deep, resonant, and guttural, completely mismatched to his small frame. Before anyone could react, the boy's body was violently thrown backward, and there was no one near him at the time. He hit the wall with enough force to leave even the experienced medical staff stunned. He lay unconscious, unresponsive, while tensions in the room grew heavier. Moments later, his older brother collapsed without explanation, sending staff into a frenzy to figure out what was happening. Not knowing what else to do, the hospital called 911 for additional help. The boys were taken to separate rooms for evaluation. The youngest soon regained consciousness, but his behavior was far from normal. He lashed out at everyone around him, screaming and thrashing with an unnatural strength. It took 5 grown men to hold him down and keep him from harming himself or others. The nurses and doctors, originally calm and professional, now moved with visible unease. These outbursts didn't seem like the behavior of a frightened child. They felt almost otherworldly. That feeling of unease turned to complete shock when the boy made a chilling declaration. With his eyes wide and unblinking, he looked at his brother and said, "It's time to die. I'm going to kill you." The room fell silent except for his voice, which seemed to hang in the air long after the words were spoken. One person who witnessed this was Valerie Washington, a caseworker from the Department of Child Safety. She'd been called in to check for signs of abuse or neglect, but as she observed the family, nothing she'd learned in training could prepare her for what she was about to see. During a conversation with the family in the exam room, the youngest son's demeanor darkened further. His voice shifted again to that low, growling tone, and then his movements became something no one could explain. Still clutching his grandmother's hand, the boy began walking backward, but he wasn't walking on the floor, he was walking straight up the wall, all the way to the ceiling. He then flipped over entirely, landing on his feet with ease. Everyone in the room froze. Valerie, along with a nurse and at least one doctor, witnessed the event and later confirmed it in official reports. The shock left Valerie visibly rattled. She requested the child repeat the act to try to understand what had just happened, but the boy seemed disoriented, claiming no memory of the incident. Whatever calm or doubt had existed before was gone now. The professionals in that room weren't just frightened. They were questioning how something so blatantly impossible had occurred right in front of them. One nurse, who had previously dismissed claims of possession or supernatural forces, later admitted that he believed something truly evil was at work. The impact on those present was undeniable. Valerie Washington, officially trained to assess and document facts, struggled to process what she had seen. She eventually wrote in her report that she believed the family was influenced by something malignant, something beyond any explanation she could provide. Valerie also developed health problems following the incident, and she refused to ever set foot in the Ammons home. For some, the experience ended any doubt about the supernatural. For others, it left lingering questions that have yet to be answered. This hospital visit wasn't just an isolated episode. It marked a critical turning point in the Ammons case. The Department of Child Safety, deeply concerned for the children's well-being, placed them into protective custody. Officials stated that their living environment posed risks to their spiritual and emotional health. Meanwhile, the family's situation caught the attention of a local priest, Reverend Michael Magino, who was contacted by the hospital's chaplain. Reverend Magino, though inexperienced with exorcisms, agreed to assist, setting the stage for the investigations and rituals that were to come. But even as more people stepped in to help, one question remained unshakable. What happens when logic and evidence fail to explain what's right in front of you? That night in the hospital had left behind scars, physical, emotional, and professional, on everyone involved. And yet, for the Ammons family, It was only one chapter in an overwhelming storm that refused to end. After leaving 3860 Carolina Street and moving to Indianapolis, LaToya Ammons and her children found the peace that had eluded them for so long. The haunting stopped, and life returned to normal. The Department of Child Services monitored the family for months, eventually closing the case in early 2013. Interestingly, there were no reports of strange activity from the house after they left, and new tenants experienced no disturbances. So, was the house responsible? Or was the phenomenon tied specifically to LaToya and her family? Whether it was fate or something beyond explanation, one thing remains clear: some questions have no answers. And believe it or not, this was only the beginning. If you want more true stories like this, real horror, unsolved mysteries, and the darkest corners of human experience, that's all we do here on The Last Two Awake. So if you're still with me, like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment. Let me know if you've ever had an experience hard to imagine and even harder to tell someone about. I'd love to hear it.